I uncovered every secret from the last 30 years.
And I have given all the proofs of who was involved with Diddy. I have presented the videotape of Diddy's parties as evidence. Now no one can save Diddy and the other celebs. Jay-Z, after watching the rest of the documentary, you'll understand everything.
Today, Saturday, January 10th, is a very bad day for Sean Combs because Netflix just dropped what 50 Cent is calling the next chapter of The Reckoning. And this time, it doesn't feel like a continuation. It feels like a message. When this release appeared on Netflix, there was no long promo run, no months of buildup, no press tour explaining what was coming. It simply showed up, quietly, suddenly, almost like it wasn't meant to make noise at first, just to exist. And that alone should tell you something. Because when powerful stories arrive without warning, it's usually not about entertainment, it's about timing. Back in December when Sean Combs' The Reckoning first dropped, people thought that was the full story. 4 parts, carefully structured, a deep dive into Diddy's empire, the allegations, the investigation, the people around him, and the moment right before everything collapsed. That documentary already shook the industry. Careers went quiet, statements stopped, conversations changed. But even then, something felt unfinished. There were moments that cut away too fast, questions that were raised but never followed all the way through, names mentioned without context, gaps that felt intentional, and 50 Cent never hid that fact. He kept saying the same thing over and over, that what people saw was only a portion of what existed. Now this new release makes that clear, because this chapter doesn't try to explain Diddy's rise. It doesn't walk through his legacy again. It doesn't educate casual viewers. It assumes you already know what happened in December. This time, the focus shifts away from the public story and toward what was happening behind closed doors. And that shift changes everything. Instead of long interviews and historical framing, the tone feels tighter, heavier, more uncomfortable. This isn't about reminding you who Sean Combs was. It's about asking why certain things were never shown before and why they're being shown now. Before we go deeper, make sure you like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell, because this story is moving fast. What makes this release unsettling isn't that it claims to expose new truths outright. It's how it reframes old ones. Moments that once felt isolated suddenly sit next to each other. Conversations that seemed harmless now carry weight. The absence of explanation becomes louder than any accusation ever could. And this is where the timing matters, because this doesn't drop in a vacuum. It drops while legal appeals are pending, while civil lawsuits continue quietly, while the industry remains largely silent, while people who once spoke freely are choosing their words carefully or not speaking at all. That silence is part of the story now. The documentary doesn't say, "Here's what happened." It asks, "Why was this never addressed?" And once that question is asked, it doesn't go away. This release also feels different because it's not aimed at the audience first. It feels aimed inward, toward the industry itself, toward people who understand exactly what certain clips, certain recordings, certain images mean without them needing to be explained on screen. Not everything is spelled out, and that's intentional, because power isn't challenged by shouting. It's challenged by context. This chapter isn't loud, it's patient. It doesn't rush. It lets moments sit long enough for discomfort to settle in, and discomfort is dangerous when it sticks around. What you're watching isn't a sequel trying to top the first one. It's a recalibration, a repositioning, almost like someone saying, "You thought that was everything." It wasn't. And that realization, that the story may not be finished, is what makes today feel different. Because once the idea of more exists, silence stops working the way it used to. What makes this chapter feel heavier is what it refuses to do. There's no dramatic voice telling you what to think, no flashing labels, no narrator spelling out accusations. Instead, the documentary slows down and lets patterns form on their own. It places moments side by side and lets the audience connect them. And that's far more unsettling than being told a conclusion. You start noticing how often certain names appear near certain situations, how timelines overlap in ways that were never openly discussed, how people who once seemed separate were actually moving through the same rooms, the same circles, the same nights. Nothing is shouted. Everything is implied through proximity. And that's where the tension lives, because implication forces memory to do the work. This chapter also feels different because it's not centered on public moments. It avoids award shows, red carpets, and interviews everyone's already seen. Instead, it lingers on the in-between spaces, after parties, private conversations, planning stages, moments before cameras were supposed to stop rolling. The kind of moments that don't usually make it into documentaries. You can feel that shift in tone immediately. The pacing tightens. Scenes don't resolve the way you expect them to. Conversations end early. Footage cuts away right when your brain starts asking questions. And that's not accidental. It's restraint. Restraint signals confidence. It tells you the creators aren't trying to convince anyone. They're simply laying pieces on the table and stepping back. Another thing that stands out is how carefully this release handles context. Nothing appears alone. Every clip, every moment, every voice is surrounded by quiet buildup. You're shown where people were, who else was present, and how often these same configurations repeat over time. Repetition is powerful because repetition turns coincidence into pattern. And patterns are what investigations are built on, not individual incidents. There's also an emotional shift that's hard to ignore. The earlier documentary carried a sense of revelation. This one carries a sense of consequence. The energy feels colder, less reactive, almost resigned, like the story has passed the point of shock and entered the phase where reality settles in. That's when things get dangerous for reputations, because outrage fades, but records remain. What's especially striking is how little commentary is needed. Long stretches pass without explanation, yet the meaning keeps building. You're not told why something matters. You're shown enough to understand that it does. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. This chapter doesn't demand your belief. It assumes your awareness. It trusts that viewers remember what was said months ago. Who denied what? Who stayed quiet? Who spoke too early and then disappeared? It trusts that you can feel the weight of what's missing just as much as what's present. That trust changes the relationship between the documentary and the audience. You're no longer being guided. You're being implicated as a witness. And that's where the real power is. Because once a story shifts from watch this to remember this, it stops being content and starts becoming record. And records don't go away quietly. By this point, the audience realizes something important. This isn't about new shock value. It's about reframing what people thought they already understood. The documentary doesn't rush forward. It circles back. It revisits moments that were once treated as footnotes and places them at the center of the frame, not to accuse, but to recontextualize. What once felt random now feels arranged. You begin to notice how often certain stories were told without follow-ups, how many times questions were acknowledged but never answered, how silence became the closing statement instead of clarity. And when you see those moments stacked together, not years apart but minutes apart, the tone changes completely. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Not because of what's shown, but because of what suddenly makes sense. The documentary leans heavily into timing. When spelling out implications, when responses simply places moments side by narratives side quietly and lets the viewer feel the friction between them. It's subtle and friction but intentional. It start remembering interviews you've seen was used as a shield, but now they feel different. Heal, but to answers distance. That once sounded confident now feel incomplete, and urgency statements that were accepted at face value. What's especially effective here is how the documentary refuses to editorialize. Selection There's no dramatic music telling you when to react. This chapter also emphasizes how narratives were managed publicly versus privately. What was said on record, what was handled off camera, and how often those two worlds never aligned. It doesn't claim deception. It highlights separation. Separation allows plausible deniability. The more you watch, the more you realize this isn't about exposing a single moment. It's about revealing a method, a consistent approach to managing attention. Let things surface briefly. Let them generate noise. Then wait. Waiting has always been the safest strategy, but waiting only works when people forget. And that's the shift happening now. The audience isn't forgetting anymore. They're revisiting, replaying, comparing, and comparison strips narratives of their protective fog. What once felt like isolated controversy now feels like part of a larger, unfinished conversation. The documentary doesn't tell you what conclusion to reach. It does something far more effective. It removes the comfort of certainty. It leaves you sitting with unresolved questions that were never meant to stay alive this long. And unresolved questions don't fade. They grow. This is the stage where the story stops belonging to the people involved and starts belonging to memory itself. Memory that doesn't reset with new headlines. Memory that doesn't move on just because time has passed. That's why this chapter feels heavier. Not louder, not angrier, just heavier. Because once patterns become visible, silence stops feeling neutral. It starts feeling intentional. And intention, once noticed, changes everything. At this stage, the documentary stops feeling like a release and starts feeling like pressure. Not pressure from accusations, but pressure from continuity. From the fact that once you line events up, they don't scatter anymore. They hold shape. And shape is dangerous because shape implies design. This section slows everything down even further. Instead of moving forward, it widens the lens. It asks a quieter question. Not what happened, but why certain moments were allowed to pass without resolution. Why some stories were treated as too complex to revisit. Why explanations were always deferred to later, and why later never seemed to arrive. What's unsettling is how familiar this pattern feels once it's pointed out. A controversy surfaces. Attention spikes. A statement is made, brief, controlled, incomplete. Then time steps in and does the rest. Time becomes the cleanup crew. The documentary doesn't frame this as coincidence. It frames it as habit. A habit built over years, refined through experience, and protected by reputation. Because when reputation is strong enough, it fills in gaps automatically. People assume the explanation must exist somewhere, even if they've never actually heard it. Assumption is powerful. It replaces evidence with comfort. Here the viewer is forced to confront how often comfort was chosen over clarity, how often silence was interpreted as dignity, how often unanswered questions were labeled old news simply because enough time had passed. But time doesn't resolve stories. It just spaces them out. And when those spaces collapse, when decades of moments are compressed into a single viewing, the gaps become obvious, almost loud. This is where the documentary becomes less about individuals and more about systems. Systems that understand how attention works, how fatigue works, how public memory can be shaped not by denial, but by patience. Patience looks harmless. Patience looks mature. Patience rarely looks like avoidance, until you realize it never ends. The film places moments back to back that were never meant to coexist, not to suggest guilt, but to remove isolation. And once isolation is gone, each moment gains weight from the ones around it. A pause feels longer. An answer feels shorter. A silence feels heavier. What's striking is how little has to be said for this effect to work. No narration pushing conclusions, no dramatic claims, just proximity, just sequence, just timing. And timing tells stories words never have to. By now, the audience isn't waiting for a reveal. They're waiting for a response. Not a statement, not a denial, but engagement. Something that acknowledges the full picture instead of fragments. Because fragments can be managed, wholes cannot. This is the point where the story quietly turns, where silence stops functioning as a shield and starts functioning as evidence of strategy. Not wrongdoing, strategy. And once strategy is visible, the relationship between power and the audience shifts. The audience stops reacting. They start observing. And observation doesn't fade when the screen goes dark. It lingers. By now, the documentary has done something subtle but irreversible. It has shifted the viewer's role. You're no longer watching to be informed. You're watching to verify. Every new moment is weighed against everything you've already seen. Every pause is compared. Every choice not to speak becomes part of the record. This is where power usually expects attention to fade, where the story should lose momentum, where the audience should move on. But that's not what happens here. Instead, the documentary leans into repetition, not repeating clips, repeating behaviors, the same kinds of answers given in different years, the same tone used in completely different situations, the same reliance on reputation to carry conversations that were never finished. Repetition doesn't feel dramatic. It feels procedural, and procedure suggests intent. What's especially uncomfortable is realizing how effective this approach has been for so long. Not because people were tricked, but because the system didn't need to trick anyone. It only needed to slow things down. Let discomfort dissolve naturally. Let memory fragment. Let time do what denial never could. And for years it worked. This chapter exposes how silence wasn't passive. It was active, carefully timed, carefully placed, appearing exactly when clarity would have forced alignment between stories that were better kept separate. You start noticing how often explanations stop just before they become specific, how frequently conversations pivot away from timelines, how accountability is replaced with generalities. Nothing false, nothing provable, just incomplete. Incompleteness is protective because complete stories demand follow-up. Incomplete ones invite patience, and patience has always favored those with control. What makes this section hit harder is that it doesn't accuse, it doesn't escalate, it doesn't even raise its voice. It simply refuses to let moments exist alone anymore. It stacks them, it compresses time, it removes the gaps where forgetting used to live. And once those gaps are gone, the audience sees something they can't unsee: consistency. Not consistency of actions, but consistency of avoidance, of restraint, of knowing exactly how much to say, and more importantly, how much not to. This is where the story becomes heavier, not because new information appears, but because old information stops feeling resolved. Things that were mentally filed away as handled suddenly feel open again, unfinished. The documentary quietly challenges a long-standing assumption that silence equals maturity, that not engaging is a sign of wisdom, that moving on means growth, and it asks a dangerous question without ever saying it out loud. What if silence wasn't strength? What if it was insulation? That question lingers. It doesn't demand an answer. It doesn't need one. Because once the viewer asks it themselves, the balance shifts. At this point, the story no longer needs momentum. It has gravity, and gravity doesn't rush. It pulls. At this stage, something important changes in how the story feels. You're no longer asking what might come next. You're watching how everyone moves now that the room knows it's being watched. Because once patterns are visible, reactions matter more than revelations. The documentary doesn't chase drama here. It slows down. It lets silence stretch just long enough for you to notice who is comfortable inside it and who isn't. That contrast is everything. Some people speak freely, others choose distance, not because they have nothing to say, but because saying anything creates a reference point, and reference points are dangerous when the past is being reassembled instead of forgotten. This is where the audience stops consuming and starts measuring. Measuring tone, measuring timing, measuring how quickly narratives adjust when pressure quietly increases. And pressure does increase. Not loudly, not online, but internally inside the structure that once relied on time to blur details. Time isn't blurring anything anymore. Every interview that resurfaces now feels different. Every old clip carries new weight. Statements that once felt neutral suddenly feel calculated. Not false, calculated. Designed to say enough without ever closing the loop. That's the tension living underneath this part of the story. Nothing explosive happens here, and that's exactly why it works. Explosions burn out. Patterns don't. Patterns settle in. They stay. They don't ask to be believed. They simply repeat until recognition becomes unavoidable. What's unsettling is realizing how predictable the responses become once you understand the system. The pauses appear at the same points. The language softens around the same topics. Accountability is acknowledged in theory, then redirected in practice. This isn't chaos, it's control. And control doesn't panic when it's questioned. It waits. It assumes patience will turn into fatigue, that attention will drift, that curiosity will give up before coherence is required. But that assumption is failing. The audience isn't asking louder questions. They're asking steadier ones. They're no longer reacting emotionally. They're watching structurally, watching how narratives protect themselves without ever saying they need protection. This is where silence stops being neutral. Silence becomes a signal A signal that certain explanations would create more clarity than comfort. A signal that some conversations are riskier to finish than to avoid. A signal that distance still feels safer than alignment. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The documentary doesn't need to say any of this directly. It trusts the viewer to arrive there on their own, because conclusions reached independently stick harder than anything you're told. This is the moment where the story gains weight without adding volume, where the lack of response becomes louder than any statement ever could, where every quiet decision adds pressure instead of relieving it. And from here on, every move will be read differently. Not because anyone is accused, not because anything is proven, but because silence has stopped feeling like the end of the conversation. By now, the audience understands something quietly powerful. This story no longer needs new material to stay alive. It's feeding on what already exists and on what still hasn't been addressed. This is the point where the documentary stops pulling information forward and starts letting absence do the work. You notice how certain names fade from the conversation, how some voices go quiet exactly when context would matter most, how responses become shorter as questions become clearer. That silence isn't accidental, it's measured. What's striking here is how restraint is used as a tool, not restraint as discipline, restraint as positioning, the choice to say less, appear less, explain less. Because explanation creates a trail, and trails invite comparison. Comparison is the real threat. The documentary shows how narratives survive not by controlling every detail, but by controlling engagement. If you don't engage, you don't create new material. If you don't create new material, old material stays unresolved instead of contradicted. That unresolved space is where power prefers to sit. But unresolved doesn't mean invisible. It means suspended. And suspension creates tension, the kind that doesn't explode, but tightens. This chapter lets that tension breathe. It doesn't rush to the next reveal. It stays with the discomfort. It allows the viewer to sit with the realization that for years, many moments were treated as separate incidents when they were actually part of a continuous pattern. Once that realization lands, everything feels different. Old statements don't sound the same. Past confidence feels rehearsed. Distance feels deliberate. Not because anything new was proven, but because coherence starts replacing coincidence. The audience begins to notice who remains comfortable speaking broadly and who avoids specifics, who embraces clarity and who keeps circling around it. These aren't dramatic shifts. They're subtle. But subtlety is where long-term strategies live. This is where the documentary becomes dangerous, not to individuals, but to systems. Systems that rely on patience outlasting curiosity. Systems that expect attention to move on before connections fully form. That expectation is no longer safe because the audience isn't rushing, they're waiting, watching, logging. And quiet observation doesn't burn out the way outrage does. It doesn't need new fuel. It feeds on consistency. The more consistent the avoidance, the clearer the structure becomes. This is the phase where the story stops asking for reactions and starts inviting evaluation. And evaluation doesn't require belief. It requires memory. Memory that now stretches across years without gaps. And once those gaps are gone, silence loses its cover. It no longer feels like maturity or restraint. It feels like a choice that keeps repeating itself. And repetition, when noticed, becomes the loudest statement of all. This is where everything shifts. Not because of a single clip, not because of one shocking moment, but because the story stops feeling accidental. Up until now, it's been easy for people to tell themselves this was just noise. Just another documentary. Just another cycle of headlines. But here, the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. What changes at this point is the lens. You're no longer watching for revelations. You're watching for reactions. And the reactions, or lack of them, tell a deeper story than any piece of footage ever could. This is the moment when viewers realize that power doesn't collapse when it's exposed. It adapts. It slows down. It gets quieter. Because silence buys time, and time has always been the safest place for unfinished stories. But this time isn't erasing anything. It's stacking it. You start to notice how quickly narratives shift away from specifics, How conversations that once felt confident suddenly become vague. How explanations stop just short of clarity. Not denial, not confirmation, just distance. Distance is the strategy. And once you recognize that, the entire past rearranges itself. Interviews you've seen before take on new weight. Statements that once felt complete now feel carefully framed. Moments that were brushed off as coincidences start lining up with uncomfortable precision. This is where the documentary stops guiding you and lets you connect the dots on your own. Because when the audience reaches conclusions independently, those conclusions stick harder. They don't feel planted. They feel earned. That's the turning point. Not when something new is said, but when nothing new needs to be said anymore. From here on, silence becomes data. Every pause is noticed. Every absence is logged. Every non-response adds pressure instead of releasing it. And pressure doesn't need noise to work. It just needs consistency. This is when the balance quietly shifts. The narrative no longer belongs to the people at the center of it. It belongs to the timeline itself, to memory, comparison, and context. The audience stops asking, "What's being revealed next?" and starts asking, "Why was this never addressed before?" That question doesn't fade, it deepens, because it's not accusatory, it's structural. It's about how long certain conversations were allowed to remain unfinished, how often clarity was postponed, how frequently silence was treated as resolution. Once viewers recognize that pattern, the story becomes irreversible. Not louder, not messier, just heavier. From this point forward, everything that follows is measured against what didn't happen in the past. And that's a standard silence can't escape. This isn't the peak of drama. It's the point of no return.